All right. Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to the California African American Museum. My name is Alexandra Mitchell, the manager of education and public programs here at CAM. I am so excited about tonight's conversation. It is a special treat from a dear friend and colleague of mine and one of my favorite writers of all time. So this is a personal treat and a professional treat in the same instance. Tonight, as you all know, we are joined to discuss the African Lookbook, a visual history of 100 years of African American women, written by curator and author Catherine E. McKinley. She draws upon her extensive personal collection of historical and contemporary photographs. These images present a visual history spanning a 100-year arc from 1870 to 1970, including what is among the earliest photography on the continent. Featuring works celebrated by African masters, studios of local legend, and anonymous artists, the African Lookbook tells an alternative narrative of African women across centuries that emphasizes their legacy of cosmopolitanism, resistance, style, and fantasy making. Tonight, McKinley is joined along with American Book Award and MacArthur Genius Grant winner, Edwidge Danticat, as they explore the book and how images are used as a form of sanctuary. Edwidge Danticat is the author of numerous books, including The Art of Death, a National Book Critics Circle finalist, Clear of Sea Light, a New York Times notable book, Brother, I'm Dying, a National Books Critics Circle Award winner and National Book Award finalist, The Dew Breaker, a PEN Faulkner Award finalist, and a winner of the inaugural Story Prize. The Farming of Bones, an American Book Award winner, Breath, Eyes, Memory, one of my favorites that I just lent out a week ago, and Oprah's Book Club selection, and Crick Crack, also a National Book Award finalist. In 2018, I'm going to pronounce this terribly incorrectly, a Nutst International Prize for Literature winner and the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. She has been published in the New Yorker, the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, and elsewhere. Catherine E. McKinley is a curator and writer whose books include Indigo, a must-have, the Book of Sarah's, the Africati, excuse me. She's taught nonfiction writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Columbia University, both in New York City. The McKinley collection featured in the African Lookbook is a personal archive representing African photographies from 1870 to present. She lives in New York City, a special city indeed. I'm now going to turn the conversation over to both of our conversationalists for this evening. The conversation will be followed by a question and answer, and we hope that you enjoy. And with that, I'll turn the conversation over. Thank you both.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Catherine, for this wonderful book. It's wonderful to be to have this opportunity to speak to you. We've known each other for a very, very long time, and I've always known you to have this passion, this obsession that has gifted us the previous books, but also this really very special lookbook, which feels, as I write in the forward, Jacqueline Woodson also wrote an introductory essay, and it feels to me like a family album. You know, I grew up in one of those houses with the pictures, you know, under plastic, you know, where pictures were rare. And it was always amazing to look through those types of family albums when you went to people's homes or in your own home, because it was often the only time where you would see like your really kind of now very proper aunt in her mini skirt or from back in the day, like in her disco outfit. So I always felt looking at this type of, you know, these types of albums, which is the same feeling. And this book, it feels very intimate in that way. I feel like I am looking at family, and I think everyone who picks this up, you know, we take a lot of images for granted now with, you know, with all the means we have, wonderful means to photograph ourselves, to photograph the people we love, and to carry those with us, you know, illuminated in the phones, but you've given us something that our foremothers, you know, these aunties did not have. So I want to thank you for that. I want to give you an opportunity to maybe introduce the book a little bit, and then I'll come back and ask you some things that I've been wanting to know also about your journey and how we came to have this wonderful gift from you.
Okay. I'm going to share just one image. It's kind of a shame not to be able to walk you through part of the visual part of the book, but I'm going to share one image and some text. So you'll lose us for a minute, and then I'll come back and talk more about what the book is. Okay, this is probably a familiar image to many of you. It's Malik Sidibe, and it's Christmas Eve. And this is a short bit from the book. Sidibe's iconic photograph. I said it was, I did say Sidibe, okay. Sidibe's iconic photograph is one of the most widely celebrated. It's an emblem of the era. 3 years after independence, Bamaqua, finely tailored siblings danced in a way that feels like a herald, lithe and playful. They touch heads in the way of lovers, but their intimacy is like the two yolks pressed together against a membrane ordered to break, intimately bound and yet soon free. Indigeneity and the African modern will struggle, sometimes violently, to be contained through the coming decades, and fashion and the lens will continue to indelibly record what will be lost to other projects of memory. The book is really, it's a social history and a trade history around African fashion, but it's also a kind of intimate storytelling about the women that engaged in the fashion making and the careers around fashion. And it's also kind of a look into the aunties' cloth box and, you know, the more intimate corners of their lives. And it's also an exploration of political history and how that continued to shape and change the things that people wore and how they thought about themselves. And then the history of the camera simultaneously, with the earliest African images being taken by African and European and some African Americans, some Caribbean people who were in Africa in the 1860s, like around 1865. So it's about their image making. They're all men. For quite a while, they would be only men. So it's also a dialogue about the camera and how women's engagement with the camera, you know, how that shaped who they are and how they found agency through the picture making. So there are some colonial, actually everything is kind of a colonial photograph because it's made within the colonial economy. So even a Sidibe photograph, he's an African photographer, but it's still a tool of empire. It's still constantly in conversation with, you know, with the kind of power plays made by Europeans and the camera and the propaganda of the colonial project. But it's very much about how African photographers and sitters engaged each other.
So what, you know, the image you showed encapsulates so many of the spirit of many of the other images in the book. I mean, there are some that are images that were not of the choosing of the people being photographed, but there's some that also exude so much joy, so much confidence. That one is particularly intimate in the sense that, you know, the composition, everything from the beautiful dress, because I know fabric and fashion is also weaved into your rendering of photography. But it has that intimacy, the joy, the composition, and you know, draws us in a very celebratory way. So it makes me think of you being drawn in, right, to these images. And how did that begin? Did you just see one and just went down an eternal rabbit hole of love? Or how did this journey begin for you in collecting these images?
I was always fascinated with with African images, we got National Geographic and Essence and Ebony. And, I was interested in like the competing lens of the kind of poverty porn, war porn versus the myth making and the kings and queens celebratory photographs of the Black media. And, I was trying to kind of reconcile that with the few people that I knew and, like, what is this world all about? And then I traveled for the first time just after graduate school. So in 1991, I was in Ghana, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. And you would make fast friends. People, everybody from the neighborhood and around would get to know you very quickly. And as I was leaving, I was given photographs. And the photo taking was always an occasion. It was expensive, so people would be in their Sunday best. And you'd have just these brilliant photographs and people would give them to you. And they felt to me like the little Victorian calling cards that, I grew up in the 60s, 70s. It was kind of the end of that era. And for a while we had little calling cards we gave out to our friends. And the photos had that same kind of wonderful feeling. And then a lot of those people I would return every year, every 2 years, and you'd start to grow these relationships and see more of their lives. And I guess the feeling I had was, I was really struck the first time I was in Ghana in particular, where there was so much, there was so much important history had happened around the independence era, and yet there were no monuments, or the monuments were they weren't there, or they were in decay or disrepair. And it struck me that there was that absence, like where's the kind of public record? And then I realized that a lot of it was in the photographs, it was in people's personal albums. And there was just this whole history there and kind of monumentalizing of things. So, and a lot of it was encoded in what people were wearing.
So when did you go from, at what point in the process did you go from getting these wonderful images being given to you and going home and putting them in a box to wanting to do something more formal and structural with them, like showing them, sharing them with others? I know you've done shows also. And at what point did that happen, where you went from viewer to curator?
It happened, I would say, probably in '97 when Seydou Keita was really introduced to the European and American public. And I met him at his opening at Gagosian Gallery, and I was actually leaving the next day for Mali. So it was just this tremendous moment to meet him. And then all of a sudden, these very intimate, small photographs were, as big as a wall. And there were all these very powerful white men around him, kind of controlling the entire story of the photographs. And, I left soon after for Mali. And I tried to kind of piece everything together. And even in Mali, I was picking photographs from new friends, and they were reminiscent of the Keita photographs. So that was kind of the first question. And that was when I started to think about what the photos mean in the art historical world, and then in the world of like art commerce. And then I started doing fashion research for the Indigo book, and I wanted to find the earliest images of indigo textiles in particular and fashion. And I couldn't rely on there were colonial sketchbooks where everybody was like, the faces were distorted because they tried to Europeanize them and the cloth was all wrong. And so I said, okay, we have to go to photos. And I realized how early the photos were. And then it became very obsessive.
Do you have a different approach to, say, like the City Bay and because there's images of photographers that we know, like there's some names you will say that people will immediately recognize them, but coming from, for me, most of, in Haiti, growing up in Haiti, most of my photographs of my childhood are of me sitting in a photo studio. And everybody knew, like there were a couple that everybody went to, and because my parents were here, we did these we sat for portraits, which also makes them feel like, you were right, they were expensive, they were art objects.
Mhm.
And so, but do you feel in your collecting, do you have a different approach to, say, the famous photographers,
Mhm.
or these or these portraits that the photographers are, you know, nobody knows who they are, but you know,
Mhm.
but they people sat in their studio and took the pictures. So how do you try to sort that out immediately when you come across a
Not at
photograph?
all. You know, the Kata, the big names, Kata and Sidibe, those are, if you look at the originals that are in the Met or in people's personal collections, they're all small. They're just like the photos that you have at home of family members. And so the times that I've displayed them, when we've had shows, we've always put them side by side. And most of what's in my collection does come from anonymous studios or studios of much lesser known photographers. And there's a lot of brilliance there. And there are even times where you question who the photographer may be. So I think that they have one meaning to the art world, and they have a kind of other meaning to what I'm hoping to do is to bring them into larger public realms, because I'm disturbed by this idea that this is, you know, that they've become people's private possessions, that they get tucked away, they get valued and you know, seen as commodities. And I'm interested in putting them in the public realm, giving access to artists and others who will kind of make something of it and make it more of that idea that you brought up of this communal album.
Part of the brilliance that you're talking about, I think, when I look at these photographs, is very early on, the way, you know, I think we're used to this now with Snapchat and the way people, you know, maneuver images and with filters and such. But there's so many of these in that I've seen elsewhere in your collections of images that are kind of the twinning. You know, there's some motifs
Yeah.
and the fabric in the background. Can you talk a little bit about the composition, and especially in settings where it was for pay, right? Someone walks in there and they said, I want to be photographed with my radio, or I
Mhm.
want a mirror image of myself. Can you talk about that sort of very creative, like the creativity of the production of the photographs?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Senegal had some of the earliest studios and had a multitude of studios, and the culture was very alive, like the culture of photo taking. And you know, they were Lebanese and European and African American, Caribbean. So there were all these different aesthetics at work. And it was a very kind of aspirational culture. So it's like, okay, I have enough money right now to afford this lesser known African photographer, but I have my eye on, you know, this other studio across town. So, and each studio had its own kind of like own ambiance and own imprint. It was really, really pretty wonderful. And textiles are so much a part of display. So when you go into, some of the photographers were shooting in villages, and they would bring textiles, or people would bring out their textiles, and you have some wonderful shots of people holding, you know, you could see the people in the background holding the textile on each side. It's the displays are just, they're extraordinary. And then there are all kinds of funny, like European chairs that were carried on ships, so that made their way into all different locales. So there's a lot there, but I think that my favorite thing is the interplay between the dress and the textiles. I'll share one very quick photo. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Oh no. Okay. Oop. I don't know if this is gonna work.
Oh yeah, we can see.
Did you see? Okay.
Yeah.
I pulled it out. This is a photo from Ghana in the
Mm.
1960s. And it was not deliberate, but the kind of interplay between the backdrops and the dresses is really brilliant.
Yeah. Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you also talk in the text about fabric a lot in a way that and that's the other side of the book too. There are the images of, there's the photography element, but there's also the ever present sewing machine and fabrics. And you talk, I mean, the two things you say about fabrics that really have stayed with me, because especially today, we had a sewing machine delivered today because my youngest is suddenly obsessed with sewing. And you talk about fabric as a statement of wealth, right? And what better way to highlight the fabric than through the photograph? But you also talk about how clothing was made, like grew with you, like you brought, it's kind of like my mother was a seamstress. That was always her advice: buy really good clothing, even if you wear it like all the time, but in different ways. And you talk about how women having certain pieces that evolve with them and that they can like work around. What is the effect in your travels and in your collecting and even in the way they're photographed? What effect is sort of this dumping of cheap outside clothing, like used clothing? What does that have had? How has that figured for in terms of representation, in terms of access, for couturier, for women who this might have been their profession?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's made some brilliant pictures because everybody loves the photographs in the studio of the women wearing bras or wearing t-shirts or all these, kind of wonderful displays of modified, like the pictures of the spaghetti Western styles and that sort of thing. So that's one thing, but it's had a really devastating impact on people's lives and on the environment in so many ways. And I do write in the book about the legacy of secondhand clothing in particular is really part of the Kennedy legacy. So Kennedy introduced aid to Africa with formula. You remember all the stories about Nestle formula that was emaciating children. And the other thing that was being dumped was secondhand clothing, which started a lot of public health issues and economic issues, because cloth, traditionally, it's represented between 40 and 60% of imports to Africa. And I'm talking over hundreds and hundreds of years, over the entire span of colonialism and beyond. And it's kind of a commodity that is at the center of all kinds of political wranglings between the West and Africa in particular. So that's a theme that runs through the book quite a bit. It was also used as, Western clothing was used a lot as a tool around independence, to declare like a new kind of nationhood. And, it seems twisted in some ways, like, okay, how are we celebrating independence and doing it with bell bottoms, or doing it with these hyper-American images of ourselves? But it was a very kind of freeing thing for a lot of young people during that era and beyond, to embrace. It wasn't really always, people read it as an embrace of the West, but a lot of it was an embrace of just symbols of freedom and of selfhood that were not tethered to like the independence project or to their parents' ideas about religion and statehood and that sort of thing. So it's a very complicated thing. Frequently people say, why are people doing this to themselves in not wearing their own clothing? But they're kind of missing some of the messages. So it's a very fraught history, but absolutely it has undermined women's economy, because women's livelihoods and their wealth was so much tied to sewing and to cloth.
And the idea that you also mentioned of having, special outfits made, right? And then made to last, made to adjust to different situations. You know,
Yeah.
it's interesting that you mentioned Kennedy because in Haiti, the used clothing were called Kennedy. They were called
Yeah.
Kennedys.
Also in parts of West Africa, they're called in Ghana. It's Bruni Wewu, the white man is dead, and
Mm,
Sierra Leone they called them Kennedys or John Kennedys. So
yeah,
there's a lot of playful naming around.
exactly. Now they're called Pepe. But I'm
Uh-huh.
not sure quite why, but it was for a long time. It was Kennedy, and it's complicated there too because you know the I guess people you know you do get to not everybody could afford to have a dress made, and it's cheaper, but it is you see the effect on the environment everywhere because the
Yeah,
discarded stuff just clogs
everywhere.
places.
The
And
beaches are covered with it.
and you mentioned that a lot of the cloth now also the traditional cloth is made in China, right? And then brought back, which is would be interesting. I think. Do you think of this project as a way? Because every time when we're talking about something like this, I'm thinking, oh, what if she went back in 10 years? What would these images like? Would you have to ask people to give you their phones? So
Yeah.
do you see? How do you see as the evolution of this project for you? Or is it more an archival project? Or
It is and it isn't. I mean, I certainly think about longevity and about how will it be housed into the future, who would access it, where would it be. I do think about that a lot. I'm working with people who are really experts in preservation with the caretaking piece. I'm trying to learn much more about how to handle them and how to store them so that they could be inherited by a museum or something of the sort. But I think right now I'm really interested in engagement with other artists and thinkers and people that really want to make something of the material. So like sometimes I'm buying or finding fragments of things and I'm like, why am I keeping this thing? But I can imagine it having a lot of value to an artist.
and have you been able to work with have you had that kind of collaboration already yet or?
Yeah, I did a shoot that was interrupted by COVID with Ruth Osai, a Nigerian photographer. It was wonderful. I'm sure you've seen her works. It's been in Rihanna's Fenty campaigns, and
Mhm.
Adidas, and all over the place. But in the book itself, Frida Orpabo, who most of you will know, is just a absolutely brilliant artist. Took images from the collection and made her collages. So they're throughout the book and they're in conversation with the photos in the book. So they're great. And that was the first really formal collaboration that I've done. And it worked out
Mhm.
very nicely. So I hope there'll be more of that.
So do you see I was thinking, and Alexandra mentioned Indigo, your one of your previous books. What do you see a connection between that book and this one? What
Yeah.
or
And even the earlier memoir, there's really kind of a through line in the narrative. So it's interesting how it keeps keeps coming back around. But I guess cloth has always been a kind of anchor, and this idea of ancestors and searching for kinds of records of who people were and
yeah,
what
I
they
think
mean to us now.
absolutely. I mean, I love this notion. I think that you talk about cloth almost as a skin,
Mhm.
right? And can you talk a little? I mean, Indigo, like Alexandra mentioned, how much she loved it. It's such a wonderful book. Can you uh, take us through that thorough line a little bit from the memoir through Indigo through this?
About skin in particular, or just
No,
what?
just in general. Yeah, but if you can talk about skin in particular. If you
Um,
also.
I'd say, well, the memoir is really about growing up Black and Jewish and adopted in the 60s and 70s, and it's a search for family. So I wrote quite a bit there about, I went off to boarding school and I felt like, okay, this is the first time I'm free of everybody saying you're adopted, like walking around with a sign that you're adopted. So I didn't have any family history but I went and kind of picked all these old photographs of Black families and Black people, and I got to boarding school and put them all up, like, here I am, here, these are my people. So I think that had a lot to do with the later collecting. I think it's still that quest for a way to kind of put myself in a community of others and kind of know who came before. And then the indigo narrative is again one of searching. It's a trip in 13 West African countries looking for this cloth that's disappearing, that there's almost no record of. And by that I mean there is certainly indigo. People are buying indigo all the time, but the old styles, the earliest kinds of patterning and cloths that had a lot of meaning, that were rich in meaning, that told stories in the stitching and the fabrication, and that had use in spiritual practice and, the kind of ephemeral parts of life. So that connects as well. But I think it really goes at my desire always to search and to get below the surface and to get very, very close to people who feel very distant to me.
And I think that's why it feels so intimate, the way you put the images together. It's like you're guiding us. We're seeing your people, and they become our people too. I think in the way that they're framed, even with the wonderful text that you have around the images. So before we open to everyone else, I want to ask, what have you been doing during this this period, because you can't travel? Yes. So how does a collector collect? Or are we just collecting ourselves in this time?
I think it's been a pause. Well, I was actually doing a lot of the editing on the book, early last year. So the first several months of COVID were just like, it was this wonderful way to hunker down. And luckily everybody was safe and my teenage kids were in the other room. So it was really kind of a nice period. And I'm thinking about what to do next. I was working on various exhibition plans and everything fell apart. We were talking about doing something in Ghana, and I really do want to return to showing the material in Africa. So I'm kind of trying to figure out how to do that when everybody's budget has busted, and it's harder.
Have you, aside from these programs that we're doing in this way, have you has the visual part of your work, like sharing the images, has that also moved online for you? Or
it has a bit, but I'm trying to figure all that out, because now that the collection has a kind of recognition, it's like, what's the next step and what's to expose or what's to kind of keep away for a time. So I'm trying to figure out. I guess I've really turned more to like the preservation issues, and I'm interested also in preservation. There's so many wonderful, wonderful archives and people who are collecting in Africa, and we have a lot of conversations with each other. It's hard to get materials. So I'm also thinking about that project of how people can support each other, with Western resources, and what it might mean to bring a collection to institution there eventually.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy we have this book though, because there is something like about looking at the images, but it's also some really, I'm old fashioned, I guess, like to just have the pages to flip through, and you can open to like a random page like this. There's so many beautiful and powerful images with also your wonderful text. So it's just nice it's a really gorgeous looking and feeling book. I would recommend it to let everybody go out and get one, or we'll be told how to get it at some point, but get it from your favorite indie bookstore. So now we're gonna throw it out to the audience if they have questions for you.
One of the questions that has come up is, Catherine, how you started your collection, why? And for me, I would add how it's a form of sanctuary for you.
Mhm.
And if you could also add on the exhibition you did in Brooklyn, I think it's almost 2 years ago now,
Yeah.
the way in which that process came about.
Mhm. So in 2019, we did a show at United Photo Industries, who is now Photoville. They were always Photoville, but that was an offshoot. Um, we had a 2-month exhibition called Auntie, and it was really a survey from 1870 to the present of women's issues, looking at this idea of the auntie and, kind of poking at it, having fun with the idea of who the auntie is. Um, and I think that, I was saying earlier about the collecting that it really started in 91 with travels. And I did a graduate degree at NYU. That's Alex and I were in the same team there. So I did that recently, and I was working with Deb Willis and Okwe Wazor and kind of really the doyens of African photography and African American photography. And that was when I started to get a new kind of intention about what I was doing and started to see the work really differently. And to also think about it outside of the academy, that it's not, this is not the preserve of the art world and it's not the preserve of the academy. It's kind of a wide world that all those things are part of.
Incredible.
Speaking of, I'm sorry, I'll bounce off some of these questions. Speaking of the aunties, you have a favorite auntie that you've kind of followed over the years. Do you want to tell everyone
This
about
is Auntie Karama. She has a whole chapter in, this is one of Frida Orapabu's collages of her. She's here. And she was in the picture that I showed. But this is kind of a look through her album and her changing fashions through independence and soon after. So it's all there in the book.
Yeah.
Incredible. Another question says, cloth and patterns have very much contributed to a Western understanding of Pan-Africanism. How do you see this as a document and dialogue with that idea, or a dialogue with African-American identity?
It's very much a dialogue, particularly in the independence era parts of the book. I mean, some of it is really surprising to people. You see it, you see the afros and you see like the Jimi Hendrix references and that sort of thing. And it's really a lot of fun and you enjoy it. But then there's a kind of narrative coming from the women that were wearing them that's surprising. So for instance, Auntie Karama talks about, I have this in one chapter in the book, she talks about wearing Afro wigs. And Afro wigs were not, the young people loved them. Older people didn't like them at all. In certain parts of West Africa in particular, there was even re-education attempts around it. And mini skirts and afros were really like a complete breach of what it meant to be a good citizen post-independence. So she talks about that. She talks about how, okay, this was fun for a while, but we couldn't wear our duku, our scarves. We couldn't put scarves on our head, which are important to womanhood and important to being a proper woman. We couldn't wear it because the afro was too big. And then after the afro, we didn't care because then we just mashed it down and put the scarf over it, and it gave a really nice shape to the headscarf. So, it doesn't, it kind of goes counter to what people expect about what Black Power meant necessarily at that time in West Africa. And then there are other obvious ways where Black Power meant quite a bit to what was going on. So it's funny. I like the tensions. I've always been interested in the tensions between Africa and African Americans, and I play on it a bit in the narrative in the book. Like all the surprising things, the things you think people like about each other, they don't. And I remember bringing friends to a woman that sold cloth in the market, and my friends, they were New Yorkers and they had on a lot of beads and a lot of jewelry and they were feeling great. And the woman was like, they're laughing at us. They think this is African. So I enjoy that sort of thing and the way that meanings get twisted around.
Incredible. I know that you took a trip to Ghana almost 2 summers ago, actually with Jacqueline Woodson, who's one of the writers for the book, also introduction, as well as Edwidge. So if you could speak a bit about the way in which you picked these two incredible writers, Jacqueline also being one of our CAM favorites, our audience loves her. I think they would love to hear about how that came about for this book.
Well, in both cases, we have old relationships. We've known each other for quite a while. And Edwidge wrote really beautifully, apart from being absolutely one of my favorite writers and someone so important to me. Edwidge wrote really wonderfully about African photography. Was it 3 years ago?
Yeah, about 3 years ago, yeah.
Or I think it was the Atlantic. But
oh, it was Harper's, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
I wrote this brilliant essay. So that was absolutely one of my first thoughts. And Jackie as well. And I wanted to really put the project, and I've heard some criticism that I should have had African women writing those introductory narratives, but I wanted to bring the photos closer to a diaspora enjoyment or a diaspora understanding. I think that's important. At the same time, I do often privilege African voices.
Absolutely. And for Edwidge, off of that question, how did you approach your contribution to the book with your perspective?
Well, I think one of the things that I've always loved about Catherine's project was it felt very familiar to me. As I mentioned, like my very, all my childhood photographs, the few that I have, were involved sitting in a photo studio with my best dress, and actually in the house where I grew up in Haiti and also in Brooklyn, we had photographs. The photographs I have of my grandparents were like them on their wedding day and then in their coffin. Like there was funeral photography, and so the formality of it, the photograph as a very special object for me was very powerful. And then, again, like I said, my mother was a seamstress, so the cloth, so it felt very personal. And I love, as a writer, looking at these moments frozen in time and imagining stories around them, because even in a lot of the photographs, even in this and the lookbook, those photographs, many of them you can imagine being taken for some loved one who's far away and being treasured and held close, and so that's for me was powerful. And of course I'm very intrigued by the history of photography on the continent, the misuse of it, which maybe it's something, Catherine, you could say a little bit more about, and the misuse of the images, especially of African women as sort of anthropological or pornographic subjects, but how, how reclaiming reclaiming those images with one's presence, as expensive as it was for some people, like going into the studio and paying for that. But maybe that would be wonderful to maybe, Catherine, you can say a little bit about that, about the misuse of the photography, and maybe how much of a corrective act it is to come and say, I'm going to be photographed the way I want to be seen, which we take for granted now, but what is a very powerful act.
Yeah, many of the photos, the disproportionate number of, or the disproportionate portion of the larger archive, not just mine, is like everything's a nude, or everything's a topless woman in the white colonial legacy. And a lot of those photos, you can see big differences in those photos. A lot of them were taken by white photographers. They were coercive. They circulated as pornography to people throughout the empire. And they just had an amazing reach. And you can see very derogatory comments on a lot of the images. And that's one history. And then you see others where they were commissioned by families. Usually they were photos just after puberty rites. So you see, like, there's this whole expansive legacy of photos where families took their daughters at the end of puberty rites to be photographed. And those are much more dignified, you know, really lovely photographs. And the intention there was usually that they were for the family, but they were also used in marriage bids. So they would send them, you know, get multiples and send them around to potential husbands. So there's a little bit of both in the book, and I think you can probably look and tell right away the differences between them.
Incredible. We're wondering about the organizing principle of the book. Is it a chronological or by region? And with that, do you see the book as a part of a larger movement in reclaiming the representation of the Black archive?
I do. It's very much that, and I'm happy I did an event with Amy Saul 2 days ago, and she has a wonderful, she's a Senegalese scholar and a model. You'll probably be familiar if you saw her face, but she has an archive as well. Ibrahima Cham, whose work is here on the cover, is also a big collector. So there's a growing body of people who are preserving and working with things. But the organizing principle of the book is really, it was hard at first, you know, you just spread everything out and you try and figure out what it all means and how you're going to cover 54 nations. And I definitely fall short. I have the material in the archive, but there was no way I was going to be able to do this cohesively with, you know, that much breadth. So what I decided to do was to organize around trade routes, because so much of this is about trade. So most of everything goes along the African Atlantic, so from Morocco down to Angola. And those are the actual routes on which Africans were trading cloth, Africans and Europeans were trading cloth and other goods. So the fabrics, like with the indigo trade, there was this rigorous trade from Senegal all the way to Angola. Cutthroat, you know, they were undermining each other. It's like the stuff of crime novels. But I decided to use that because the photographers were plying those routes at the same time, European and African and Arab. So that was it. So it's mostly along the coast and then up into the Sahel, because the coastal routes met the trans-Saharan routes.
Incredible. You touched on it a bit, but as we sit so firmly in an Instagram era contemporarily, how do you see this being a part of the narrative that's changing, especially building on the idea of self-presentation?
Well, the narrative has changed so much. You know, I live near Times Square, so everybody comes to Times Square, and the selfie game is really intense out here. And I think it's just wonderful. I see families and individuals, like young women who live in the city, who come and gather with their friends and do all of this photo taking. And, you know, the fact is that there's a record of a Nigerian woman who owned a studio in 1903 in Nigeria. She was a Saro, she was a Brazilian returnee to Nigeria. She had this studio, she's from a wealthy family, but we don't know if she was actually taking pictures or if she just owned the studio. So it may just have been commerce. But from there, the record jumps to Felicia Bon in Ghana in 1957. And I don't know, maybe there are really no female photographers in that span in between. We don't really see a lot of photography by African women until the late 90s, 2000s, you know, like in any real number. So, and then at the same time, we're getting like the selfie culture. So it really just like, it absolutely exploded the tradition of the studio. And it's the first time where girls and women have like this enormous power to like show it any way that they want to.
Does that studio culture, not in the same way, does that still exist? Is that something?
Yeah. To an extent. I mean, you won't find, the wonderful thing is a lot of the old studios like James Barner, and there's been a effort to preserve the studios, but they're just kind of like spaces that you can go in and say, James Barner was here. But really during the 80s, with color photography in particular, a lot of the studios started to close, or they were taken over or started by by Asian and Arab entrepreneurs. So there were fewer and fewer and fewer African-owned studios because the color process was so expensive. And then people were starting to buy the point and shoot cameras.
Mhm.
So it's really, it's lost. It's a tradition that's lost.
And of
But
course
you
the
see, like in
phones,
Ghana,
right?
there's still men that walk around with, with Polaroid cameras or other cameras, and you can still pay to have something taken. But it's all outdoors. It's not in that, or they might set up like a chair and decorate the chair.
I know both of you are so protective of your writing and close to your writing, but one of the things I would love for you to share with the audience is two of your favorite parts of your writing in the book, and things that you hope that they look for or gain from picking up the book when they read it themselves.
Well, I mean, I want to share what some my favorite Catherine stuff. I again, we talked about this, the idea of cloth, I think, as skin, right? And the element of self-preservation that you talk about, self-presentation as self-preservation in a way that you talk about, and bridging, making that connection from this total scarcity, right, of being unable to control your image to then now having this flooding. And one of my favorite periods in the book where you see that emerge is with the influence of African American imagery on some of the photographs, right? And this merging of diaspora, this joining, which I think is also beautifully represented there. But in terms of what, I shared a bit of what I shared here tonight about my history with sort of the formality of photography, and I had this experience, that early in my career, where I had this album that someone was writing an article about me, someone I trusted, and they asked me to messenger some, like, my very treasured pictures, which are rare and scarce, and I did, and they lost the album. So I feel like when I go into these books, like I'm looking for myself. And I'm looking for these sort of, and every, these images, even the ones that, that were made for evil, terrible purposes, they were meant to last, they were made to last, either to dehumanize, but the ones where people are claiming their vision of themselves, they're meant to last, they're meant to be shared, they're meant to be generational heirlooms. So when I go into, I go into that book with that in mind, with just ready to be, to just have something close to me, like reinforced about photography and its importance, which I have a very hard time convincing my children, because they have like 1,000 photos in their devices, but it's, for me, it's still a kind of scarce. It's almost like a painting, going, each of these photographs is like a painting in some way.
Yeah, and the African photographs, well, they are truly scarce. I mean, the Senegalese talk about how, like, an entire national history went into the ocean, literally. Like, there was times when things were just being dumped. They're just gone. And I know in Ghana, I was noticing the summer before last, when I went to visit friends, how much, the environment is just very harsh on photos. So people have beautiful photos in their homes, and the erosion is really significant.
And also the presentation, often it was behind glass, it was taped like with gift wrapped almost.
Yeah.
So it wasn't museum quality preservation, which is why your own preservation work will be interesting. So what do you want the folks to look for, like, and then your answer to that question?
In the book.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite parts is, it really kind of says it all there. It's not all that substantive in the book, but I have some cloth where at one point during World War II, the typical wax cloth, like what everybody calls African prints and, seems like this iconic thing, is disappearing because of the war. And so the Dutch who were manufacturing it decided that they would do much more. They'd do this new cloth called fancy cloth, which is like a wax knockoff, but they started to use the technology of photography on it. So that's when you get the pictures of, African presidents on cloth, and some are more intimate, like engagement parties, with images, or somebody's birthday. They do that sort of thing. So I love that. That's like the ultimate moment with the two things that come together so powerfully. And also where, it was a chance, like when your beloved dies, all of a sudden you could put their photograph on the cloth, and 600 people could make a dress from that same fabric, and very powerful.
And do people now there are now T-shirts made, I would imagine. Yeah.
You see it like the diaspora. I was even seeing some Puerto Rican funerals that look so much like Ghanaian funerals with the use of photographs. It's wonderful.
And speaking of a diaspora through line with the cloth, Catherine, I know you collect a lot of that cloth also in your personal archive. Edwidge, is there any parallels between the textile traditions that you see in Haiti?
Well, in Haiti, it was the tradition that would connect is of the seamstress, right? And my mom was a seamstress, and there was certainly for funerals, if all the women were going to wear white, you would go to the same seamstress and have the same dress made for different people. So that, like, for us, that's also a tradition that's been lost by the used clothing more and more. The couturier, the seamstress, because it's just cheaper to get for a lot of people to get used clothing. So there's that gift in a way has been lost. And one of the things that I also noticed in the book, in the different fashion, like when I was younger, young women, you had to learn to embroider in some way. So that was a way of you made, as part of your trousseau, you would embroider your tablecloth, you would get a pattern. And so I had to learn to embroider, which is interesting. Again, it's like my girls want to embroider. I didn't want to embroider, but they're also, I feel like my seamstress gene skipped the generation, but I have found because of their desire to sew, a kind of calming element to dealing with cloth, to trying to make something. So is that something you sort of like the more organic or sort of healing element of that whole of dealing with cloth? Is that something?
Yeah, sewing culture is so alive still in most parts of, less so I think in Southern Africa, but in West Africa in particular, it's so alive. You kind of plan a week or a couple of weeks ahead what's coming, and you're always thinking about your outfit. But yeah, it's a very sensuous thing. And then in most cultures, cloth really is seen as like this spiritual vessel. It holds the spirit. So the idea of when they say the white man is dead about second clothing, they are really saying like this is the white man's spirit. So, or if you even casually in Ghana, if you casually say you like someone's dress and it sounds like, if you sound like you might want that dress, they say, oh, like it's my spirit. Or Auntie Karama would always say, oh, you always disgrace me because you want someone's spirit.
Well, it is on your, right? It is like your second skin, I suppose. What do you think of this? I know you've mentioned it elsewhere, of the now, the big fashion houses being influenced or having their version of these prints, right?
It's really in the West, it's really incredible because a lot of the big fashion houses, Gucci, et cetera, they've hired a lot of African photographers, like, so the aesthetic has bled into all this commercial campaigning, which is, it's interesting on one level. It's kind of wonderful to see on a level of recognition of that artistry, but the lines have definitely started to blur. So, and like Dior did that huge campaign a year ago where they just knocked off wholesale like a woman's closet.
Hmm.
How are we for time?
And and
Oh.
are younger and are African designers a part of that, or
They are definitely a part of it, but I don't think they hold the same responsibility because they're trying hard to reach into international markets and to be recognized, and they're accepting the Louis Vuitton, Monet prizes, which we certainly can't blame them for doing that, but then there's that kind of co-opting as they move further in their careers. But the great thing that gives you a sense of what was happening in history is that they're kind of ahead of the game. So just when Dior knocks it off, they're 10 miles ahead of them.
and hopefully there's more avenues for them to be seen, right? They have they can be online, and they can reach customers.
And they're just, they're making their own rules, which is that's great.
Which is in the tradition of these, of the aunties. Then
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely in the auntie tradition. I'll close with this last question. What has been the response from any living women in the book, and how did they respond to seeing themselves within this context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sad thing is that I think everybody who I knew personally has died except for Auntie Karama. She's still very much alive. She has a big role in the book. I think she's a little, like, she loves it, and she says I'm disgracing her all over the world. But her photos are really, they're just brilliant. They're some of the standouts in the book.
I'm sure they're incredibly gorgeous and that they're an honor and not a disgrace. We'll take that as a positive joke.
Teasing.
But with that, I would like to close the conversation. Thank you both for this incredible contribution. Thank you both for joining Cam. Thank you all for tuning in at home. I hope you all will purchase the book through your local book vendor. We love SOY Books here in Los Angeles. The African Lookbook, with a forward, of course, by Edwidge Danticat and Jacqueline Woodson, two of our favorite writers at CAM. Everybody, be safe, be wonderful, be well. Catherine, Edwidge, thank you both so much. Everybody have a great night. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.